So good morning, everybody. When I saw Sheldon Narayan up here and I realized he was going to give us some of his corn, I was wondering to myself whether I could follow. But he ended up on a note that I could easily follow on, because life is in fact a stage, as Shakespeare reminds us, and we're all on that stage. And when you are in the workplace, I think you are more on a stage than in any other place or time of your life. What I want to begin with this morning is a presentation which some of you may have seen. TEDx is an organization that gives us some of the best talks, originating from mainly the USA, Canada, and now from Trinidad as well. And the Trinidadian talk that made the world scene, 500,000 hits almost, was done by Afra Raymond, and it was a talk on corruption. So I want to invite those of you who have seen it, you'll get a chance to see it again. Those who have not seen it, enjoy.
Okay, this morning I'm speaking on the question of corruption. And corruption is defined as the abuse of a position of trust for the benefit of yourself, or in the case of our context, your friends, your family, or your financiers. Okay? Friends, family, and financiers. But we need to understand what we understand about corruption. And we need to understand that we have been miseducated about it. And we have to admit that. We have to have the courage to admit that, to start changing how we deal with it. The first thing is that the big myth, number one, is that in fact it's not really a crime. When we get together with friends and family and we discuss crime in our country, crime in Belmont, or crime in Digo, or crime in Marabella, nobody is speaking about corruption. That's the honest truth. When the commissioner of police comes on TV to talk about crime, he isn't speaking about corruption. And we know for sure when the Minister of National Security is speaking about crime, he's not talking about corruption either. The point I'm making is that it is a crime. It's an economic crime because we're involving the looting of taxpayers' money. Public and private corruption is a reality. As somebody who comes from the private sector, I could tell you there's a massive amount of corruption in the private sector that has nothing to do with government. The same bribes and backhanders and things that take place under the table, it all takes place in the private sector. Today, I'm focusing on public sector corruption, which the private sector also participates in. The second important myth to understand, because we have to destroy these myths, dismantle them and destroy them and ridicule them, the second important myth to understand is the one that says that in fact corruption is only a small problem. If it is a problem, it's only a small problem. That in fact it's only a little 10 or 15%. It's been going on forever. It probably will continue forever, and there's no point passing any laws because there's little we could do about it. And I want to demonstrate that that too is a dangerous myth, very dangerous. It's a piece of public mischief. And I want to speak a little bit, take us back about 30 years. We're coming out today from Trinidad and Tobago, a resource-rich, small Caribbean country. And in the early 1970s, we had a massive increase in the country's wealth. And that increase was caused by the increase in world oil prices. We call them petrodollars. The treasury was bursting with money. And it's ironic because we're standing today in the central bank. You see, history is rich in irony. We're standing today in the central bank. And the central bank is responsible for a lot of the things I'm going to be speaking about. Okay, we're talking about irresponsibility in public office. We're speaking about the fact that across the terrace, the next tower is the Ministry of Finance, and there's a lot of connection with us today, so we're speaking within the temple today. Okay? Now, the first thing I want to talk about is that when all of this money flowed into our country about 40 years ago, the government of the day embarked on a series of government-to-government arrangements to have rapidly developed the country. And some of the largest projects in the country were being constructed through government-to-government arrangements with some of the leading countries in the world, the United States and Britain and France and so on and so on. As I said, even this building we're standing in, that's one of the ironies. This building was part of that series of complexes, what we call the Twin Towers. It became so outrageous, the whole situation, that in fact a commission of inquiry was appointed, and it reported in 1982. 30 years ago it reported, the Bala report, 30 years ago. And immediately the government-to-government arrangements were stopped. The then Prime Minister went to Parliament to give a budget speech, and he said some things that I'll never forget. They went right in here. I was a young man at the time. He went right into my heart. And he said that, in fact, let me see if this thing works. Are we getting a? Yeah. That's what he told us. He told us that, in fact, 2 out of every $3 of our petrodollars that we spend, the taxpayers' money, was wasted or stolen. So the 10 or 15% is pure mischief. As we say, it's a Nancy story, forget it. That's for little children. We are big people, and we're trying to deal with what's happening in our society. Okay, this is the size of the problem. Okay, 2/3 of the money stolen or wasted. That was 30 years ago. 1982 was Bala. So what has changed? I don't like to bring up embarrassing secrets as an international audience, but I have to. 4 months ago, we suffered a constitutional outrage in this country. We call it the Section 34 fiasco. The Section 34 fiasco. A suspicious piece of law, and I'm going to say it like it is, a suspicious piece of law was passed at a suspicious time to free some suspects. And it was called, those people are called the Piarco Airport accused. I'm going to have my own lexicon speaking here today. They are the Piarco Airport accused. It was a constitutional outrage of the first order, and I have labeled it the plot to pervert Parliament. Our highest institution in our country was perverted. We are dealing with perverts here of an economic and financial nature. You get how serious this problem is. There was massive protest. A lot of us in this room took part in the protests in different forms. Most importantly, the American embassy complained. So Parliament was swiftly reconvened, and the law was reversed. It was repealed. That's the word lawyers use. It was repealed. But the point is that Parliament was outwitted in the whole course of events. Because what really happened is that because of the suspicious passage of that law, the law was actually passed into effect on the weekend we celebrated our 50th anniversary of independence, our Jubilee of Independence. So that is the kind of outrage of the thing. It was a kind of a nasty way to get maturation, but we got it, because we all understood it. And for the first time that I could remember, there were mass protests against this corruption. And that gave me a lot of hope. Okay, those of us who are, sometimes you feel like you're a little bit on your own doing some of this work. That passage of the law and the repeal of the law fortified the case of the Piarco Airport accused. So it was one of those really superior double bluff kind of things that took place. But what were they accused of? What was it they were accused of? I'm being a bit mysterious for those of you out there. What were they accused of? We were trying to build or reconstruct largely an airport that had grown outdated. The entire project cost about $1.6 billion, Trinidad and Tobago dollars. And in fact, we had a lot of bid rigging and suspicious activity, corrupt activity took place. And to get an idea of what it consisted of, and to put it in context in relationship to this whole second myth about it being no big thing, we can look at the second slide here. And what we have here, this is not, I am not saying so. Okay? This is the Director of Public Prosecutions in a written statement. He said so. And he's telling us that for the $1.6 billion cost of the project, $1 billion has been traced to offshore bank accounts. $1 billion of our taxpayers' money has been located in offshore bank accounts. Being the kind of suspicious person I am, I'm outraged at that. And I'm going to pause here. I'm going to pause now and again and bring in different things. I'm going to pause here and bring in something I saw in November last year at Wall Street. I was at Zuccotti Park. It was autumn, it was cold, it was damp, it was getting dark. And I was walking around with the protesters looking at the One Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street movement, walking around. And there was a lady with a sign, a very simple sign, a kind of a battered-looking blonde lady. And the sign was made out of Bristol board, as we say in these parts, and it was made with a marker. And what it said on that sign hit me right in the center. It said, if you're not outraged, you haven't been paying attention. If you're not outraged by all of this, you haven't been paying attention. So listen up, because we're getting into even deeper waters. My brain started thinking, well, what if, because I'm suspicious like that, I read a lot of spy novels and stuff. What if but to make it in this wrongs, you have to read a lot of spy novels and follow some of that stuff, right? But what if this wasn't the first time? What if this was just the first time that the so-and-sos had been caught? What if it had happened before? How would I find out? Now, the previous two examples I gave were to do with construction sector corruption, okay? And I have the privilege at this time to lead the Joint Consultative Council, which is a not-for-profit. We're at jcc.org.tt, and we are the leaders in the struggle to produce a new public procurement system about how public money is transacted. So those of you who are interested in finding out more about it or joining us or signing up in any of our petitions, please get involved. But I'm going to segue to another thing that relates, because one of my private campaigns I've been conducting for over 3.5 years is for transparency and accountability around the bailout of CL Financial. CL Financial is the Caribbean's largest ever conglomerate, okay? And without getting into all of the details, it is said to have collapsed. I'm using my words very carefully. It's said to have collapsed in January of 2009, which is just coming up to nearly 4 years. In an unprecedented fit of generosity, and you have to be very suspicious about these people, in an unprecedented, and I'm using that word carefully, unprecedented fit of generosity, the government of the day made a written commitment to repay all of the creditors. And I could tell you without fear of contradiction, that hasn't happened anywhere else on the planet. Let's understand, because we lack in context. People tell us it's just like Wall Street. It's not just like Wall Street. Trinidad and Tobago is like a place with different laws of physics or biology or something. It's not just like anywhere. It's not just like anywhere. It's not just like anywhere. Here is here, and out there is out there. Okay? I'm serious, you know. Listen, they've had bailouts on Wall Street. They've had bailouts in London. They've had bailouts in Europe. In Africa, they've had bailouts. In Nigeria, 6 of the major commercial banks collapsed at the same time as ours. It's interesting to parallel how the Nigerian experience has, how they've treated with it. And they've treated with it very well compared to us. Nowhere on the planet have all the creditors been bailed out in excess of what their statutory entitlements were. Only here. So what was the reason for the generosity? Is our government that generous? And maybe they are. Let's look at it. Let's look into it. So I started digging and writing and so on, and that work could be found, that's my personal work, could be found at afraraymond.com, which is my name. It's a not-for-profit blog that I run. Not as popular as some of the other people, but there you go. But the point is that the bitter experience of Section 34, that plot to pervert Parliament, that bitter experience that took place in August when we were supposed to be celebrating our independence, going into September, forced me to check myself and recalculate my bearings and to go back into some of the work, some of the stuff I'd written and some of the exchanges I'd had with the officials to see what was really what, as we say in Trinidad and Tobago, who is who and what is what. Okay, we want to try to recalculate. And I made a Freedom of Information application in May this year to the Ministry of Finance. The Ministry of Finance is the next tower over. This is the other context. The Ministry of Finance, we are told, is subject to the provisions of the Freedom of Information Act. I'm going to take you through a worked example of whether that's really so. The central bank in which we stand this morning is immune from the provisions of the Freedom of Information Act. So in fact, you can't ask them anything, and they don't have to answer anything. That is a law since 1999. So I plunged into the struggle, and I asked 4 questions. And I'll relate the questions to you in short form with the reply, so you could understand, as I said, where we are. Here's not like anywhere else. Question number 1. I asked to see the accounts of CL Financial. And if you can't show me the accounts, the Minister of Finance is making statements, passing new laws and giving speeches and so on. What are the figures he's relying on? It's like that joke, I want whatever he's drinking. And they wrote back and said to me, well, what do you really mean? So they hit my question with a question. Second point, I want to see who are the creditors of the group who've been repaid. Let me pause here to point out to you all that $24 billion of our money has been spent on this. That is about $3.5 billion US dollars coming out of a small, we used to be resource-rich, Caribbean country. Okay? And I asked the question, who was getting that $3.5 billion? And I want to pause again to bring a context, because context helps us to get clarity in understanding this thing. There's a particular individual who is in the government now. The name of the person doesn't matter. And that person made a career out of using the Freedom of Information Act to advance his political cause. Okay, his name isn't important. I wouldn't dignify it, I'm on a point. The point is, that person made a career out of using the Freedom of Information Act to advance his cause. And the most famous case was what we came to call the secret scholarship scandal, where in fact there was about $60 million in government money that had been disbursed in a series of scholarships, and the scholarships hadn't been advertised, and so on and so on and so on. And he was able to get the court, using that act of parliament, the Freedom of Information Act, to release the information. And I thought that was excellent. Fantastic. But you see, the question is this: if it's right and proper for us to use the Freedom of Information Act and to use the court to force a disclosure about $60 million in public money, it must be right and proper for us to force a disclosure about $24 billion. You see? But the Ministry of Finance, the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance wrote me and said to me, that information is exempt too. You see? This is what we're dealing with, okay? The third thing I would tell you is that I also asked for the directors of CL Financial whether in fact they were making filings under our Integrity in Public Life Act. We have an Integrity in Public Life Act as part of our framework, supposed to safeguard the nation's interest. And public officials are supposed to file to say what it is they have in terms of assets and liabilities. And of course, I've since discovered that they're not filing. And in fact, the Minister of Finance has not even asked them to file. So here we have it. We have a situation where the basic safeguards of integrity and accountability and transparency have all been discarded. I've asked the question in a legal and required fashion. It's been ignored. The sort of thing that motivated us around Section 34, we need to continue to work on that. We can't forget it. I have defined this as the single largest expenditure in the country's history. It's also the single largest example of public corruption according to this equation. And this is my reality check. Where you have an expenditure of public money, and it is without accountability, and it's without transparency, it will always be equal to corruption. Whether you're in Russia or Nigeria or Alaska, it will always be equal to corruption. And that is what we are dealing with here. I'm going to continue the work, to press on, to get some resolution of those matters with the Ministry of Finance. If it is I have to go to court personally, I will do that. We will continue to press on. We continue to work within JCC. But I want to step back from the Trinidad and Tobago context and bring something new to the table in terms of an international example. We had the journalist Rebecca Brooke speaking about her battle against government corruption, and she introduced me to this website, alvatelli.com. And alvatelli.com is a way for us to have an open database for freedom of information applications and speak with each other. I could see what you were applying for. You could see what I applied for, what replies I got. We can work on it together. We need to build a collective database and a collective understanding of where we are to go to the next point. We need to increase the consciousness. The final thing I want to say is in relation to this one, which is a lovely website from India called ipaidabbribe.com. They have international branches, and it's important for us to tune into this one. ipaidabbribe.com is really important. Good one to log on to and see. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to ask you for your courage. Discard the first myth, it is a crime. Discard the second myth, it is a big thing. It's a huge problem. It's an economic crime. And let us continue working together to betterment in this situation, stability and sustainability in our society.
What Afra Raymond is trying to say to us and to the world is that when people talk corruption these days, they tend to think of it as not really a crime, right? It's just part of life. It's only a small problem, right? And that's because people don't really hear the figures. When you hear that 2 out of every $3 is either wasted or stolen, That should make you sit up and think again. One of the things that I've been trying to find out is how much of our national budget in terms of government expenditure goes that way. Because Afra was talking about the energy sector, right? But how much of the budget that we claim to be 60-something billion dollars, if you were able to check it, how much of it is literally stolen? And then the third myth that he identifies is there is very little that we can do about it. Is that how you feel? Okay. How do we define corruption? Corruption has been defined by Transparency International as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. The abuse of entrusted power for private gain. Afra defines it as abuse of a position of trust for the benefit of self or others, especially family and friends. Now, immediately, I want to pull myself away from what Afra has said a bit. Because when you think of that, the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, immediately I hope you understand that corruption is not only about money. Corruption is not only about money. When we talk about sexual abuse and so on, that is corruption. It may have nothing to do with money. It's the abuse of entrusted power, sometimes the power of a parent, a step-parent, a senior relative, right? Sometimes the person may not even be aware of what is happening. Somebody pull the switch? Oh, okay. And, so we need to move away from a sense that corruption is only about money and who passing what and so on. Because the very people who are involved in that question of passing money are very often corrupt in other ways as well. The different forms of corruption, I had hoped to be able to put that up on the screen as well, but I didn't get a chance to really do that. But there are many forms of corruption. I just want to go through a list that comes again from Transparency International. You have bribery, extortion, fraud, trafficking, bribery, extortion, fraud, trafficking, embezzlement, cronyism, gifts, nepotism. Embezzlement, cronyism, gifts, nepotism. The majority of you here are women this morning. How often do you experience the cronyism of the males with whom you have to work, or the male bosses around you? From time to time, some friends I have who are senior execs in their companies, they tell me that there are some meetings they never are even invited to, right? Because the males have their own crony network that makes some of those hard decisions. And then there's coercion, deception, theft, and unfair discrimination. Coercion, deception, theft, and unfair discrimination. I want to just, in addition to that list, go through some situations briefly. And I want you to ask yourself, do I consider that corruption? If an employee receives compensation for hours that he or she has not worked, all right? If an employee uses longer lunch or coffee breaks than he or she is entitled to, punches the time card for someone else, comes to work late and leaves early, receives compensation as though he or she is hurt or ill when that is further from the truth does personal work in company working hours, uses machines, photocopying and otherwise, for private matters, makes private long-distance calls on company phones, and listen to this one, does some of the above, claiming, I'm only doing it for my pastor. Takes stationery, pens, pencils, and other materials from the office for your private use. Takes cash from the petty cash, which you have some responsibility for your private use. And I've had to deal with that as a parish priest from time to time. Receives presents from suppliers. Ring any bells? So those lists invite us to see some of the nuances that are there, that even if we may be able to say, yes, I know that's clearly corruption, with a number of these things, there are questions. We're not too sure where we fall. What's the difference between a bribe and an incentive? If any of you run a company, or maybe Father Christo as a parish priest, people working in the parish, you give them an incentive. What's the difference between that and a bribe? You give employees the chance to come together and make a group gift to the boss. But one employee decides, oh, no, I'm giving the boss my own personal gift. Where does that fall? What message are you sending? So in addition to simply the fact about lying and cheating and so on, there is also, when you're talking corruption, to ask yourself, what's your purpose? Because you might be doing something that seems to be very good, very kind, but deep down inside there's something, some other reason that's lurking that you and you alone know. Today we're not meant to go into all aspects of corruption, and I was asked particularly to look at the Catholic perspective. And first I want to say I don't believe in anything like the Catholic perspective. Right? I think there are some Catholics who long to be able to say, I belong to the Catholic Church and we have it all. There is a Catholic perspective, not only because the Catholic Church in all of these things, right, begins from what we call a natural law perspective, where we are looking at the thing as it is. There is no necessarily faith analysis that's going on. We're just analyzing it as it is. We're trying to get the facts. We're trying to get as objective a rational understanding of what is going on as possible. Right? And out of that, we come as people of faith to say, okay, where do I stand? And in all of moral theology, particularly when it comes to public matters, social and political affairs, there has been a very strong understanding that you do end up in many situations working from what we call a theology of compromise. Meaning by that you sometimes caught up with the lesser of two evils. You're sometimes caught up with situations which are real dilemmas, and people may choose either decision and know themselves to be possibly acting in the best way that they can. So to talk about the Catholic perspective may be laying a trap for you to fall in yourself. The Church's teaching on these matters is usually seen in the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, a one volume which, if you're really interested in the social teaching of the Church, you must buy it. It's a wonderful document. I've given it to one or two of my political friends. I don't know whether they've read it. But what I found interesting is that when it came to corruption, it didn't say very much, right? partly because corruption as a moral issue is only now being taken up by the popes. But what we do note is three things. First of all, corruption in any form is against the common good. Why? Because it is really meant to promote a certain inequality in any particular situation. Political corruption is the most serious of all because it betrays both the moral principles and the norms of social justice. And it leads, therefore, not simply to a deed, but accumulatively, it leads to a distrust of public institutions. And this is what I think a lot of politicians don't understand. When you become regularly corrupt, when that becomes a habit, when people see the habit in motion, what they themselves then find is, hey, I can't trust these people anymore. And we have a serious problem of trust and confidentiality and confidence in our politicians and our political institutions, and that has consequences for a lot of other institutions in the society. A third thing that the compendium notes, and which again has only recently come to the fore, is the corruption associated with aid. Not AIDS, aid. That is, when you look at all these disasters that happen, and I'm pretty sure it's happening in the Philippines now, the aid itself never reaches those for whom it's destined. And it goes in all kinds of different directions. And there are people in the world who plot deliberately, right, to divert aid to their own personal gain. I will say nothing about how that has happened in Trinidad. But one of the problems, for example, that we've been talking about with regard to Haiti is the fact that not just in the instance that was public knowledge here, but even in organizations that have the best of intentions, the aid never reached the people. Corruption in humanitarian aid is always shocking. This often makes it a taboo subject. Aid agencies, governments, and communities fear for their reputations, but only by discussing it openly can we tackle it. So in recent months, there has been a determined effort to raise the issue publicly, and some people are very angry about that. We must stress that addressing corruption doesn't mean condoning it, nor does it mean anyone is especially vulnerable to it, so that countries like Haiti, like the Central African Republic, like the Philippines, need to understand that openly raising the question is to their benefit. We should not make them pay the price of feeling that the rest of the world thinks that they are somehow worse than other people. An issue which I thought I would just mention in passing, and I'm glad that I thought of mentioning it in passing because of the audience here this morning, is the question of gender and corruption. Are women less corrupt than men? Some work has been done on the impact of corruption on women as a group. That if we number women among the more vulnerable in society, especially in poorer countries, corruption does affect women more than it affects men. But the question of whether women are more corrupt than men, the jury is still out on that, although what we do know is that women are less involved in the ordinary business of society, and therefore are less likely to either be involved in corruption or condone it. And then psychologically, it seems the research indicates that women react more strongly to the risk of detection. Men tend to, but women are much more concerned about the risk of detection. So, it's easy in what I've said before to see that what the church is involved in is trying to deal with corruption as a human and social problem. And in doing that, it's doing basically what everybody else in the society is trying to do. But is there anything that we bring to all of this that is unique? And I would have said no until Jorge Bergoglio became Pope. And he opened it up in a way that nobody else has done. I want to quote him directly. While many sins can lead to corruption, sinners recognize their own weakness and are aware of the possibility of forgiveness. From there, the power of God can come in. People who are corrupt, on the other hand, have become blind to the transcendent, replacing God with their own powers and ability. A sinner expects forgiveness. The corrupt, on the contrary, don't, because they don't feel they have sinned. He's immediately taking it on to a very deep spiritual level. They don't feel they have sinned. They have prevailed. One who is corrupt is so holed up in the satisfaction of his own self-sufficiency that his bloated self-esteem refuses to face the reality of his fraudulent and opportunistic behavior. Francis said, he has the face of someone trying to say, it wasn't me, or as my grandmother would say, the face of a darling little angel. The ability of the corrupt to disguise their true self should qualify them for an honorary degree in social cosmetology. Corruption, however, can never remain hidden forever. Evidence of it eventually oozes or bursts forth, like all things that are forced to stay closed in or wrapped up too tightly within themselves. But the corrupt don't notice the stench. He continues, it's like bad breath. Rarely the person with bad breath realizes it. It is others who notice it, and they have to point it out for him. The amount of built-up resistance is enormous. You who would pride yourselves in being Catholics in the workplace, and the crazy Catholic talked about how, we are Catholics, we must be the best. Ha ha. The Pope goes on. Corruption isn't an instance of one singular act, but it represents a state of being, a culture that an individual or whole society can get caught up in and accustomed to without realizing it. Priests, religious, and faithful Catholics are not immune to corruption. And then he quotes a Latin aphorism, corruptio optimi pessima. The corruption of the best is the worst thing. The path to corruption for them may begin with a painful situation which always demoralizes. People get used to the status quo and feel they shouldn't be surprised or continue to suffer in the face of further defeat. The heart doesn't want any problems. The subtle process of corruption in a religious man or woman produces a spirituality that becomes either mediocre or lukewarm. And then, just last week, he had this to say. The double life of a Christian does much harm, so much harm. They say, but I am a benefactor of the church. I put my hand in my pocket and I give to the church. But with the other hand, he robs. He robs the state, he robs the poor. He is unjust. This is the double life. And this merits, says Jesus, not myself, that a millstone be placed around his neck and he be thrown into the sea. So Pope Francis invites us to think about corruption not simply in terms of the deeds that divert this or change that, He sees it as something that is affecting us at a deeply spiritual level. And that the greatest harm is that we become so accustomed to it as individuals or as a society that we no longer see it as harmful to us. It is in that context that we need to look to our own response. I think in the first place, we always, if we understand the Christian gospel, come to these responses not as individuals, but as a community. And I really want to underline that. We will not be able to respond to this kind of sin unless we respond together. That means that we look out for each other. That means that we have a sense that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We do not come to it as self-righteous Catholics who see all this dirt and filth and stench out there, and we must somehow go in to clean it up. That leads us, as Pope Francis keeps saying again and again, down a road in which we ourselves will stumble and fall. So we seek a response whereby we support one another, we experience in fellowship, and we try to do what we can together. In that context, I think it's important to support the whistleblower, people who sometimes come to information that pricks their conscience, and they have to decide what to do. They see it in front of them. Sometimes they feel very alone, and we have even had instances where whistleblowers commit suicide because of the burden that they feel. Supporting the whistleblower must mean helping somebody to understand what their motive is. Why do you feel moved to do something about what you are experiencing? Secondly, do you evaluate properly what you're faced with? Because it is so easy sometimes to come at something without sufficient knowledge. And anytime you come at something without sufficient knowledge, you can't act properly. And that again is why it can't be simply an individual thing. And most importantly, and that's a challenge to the church, how do we protect people? And here I'm not talking airy-fairy about, a support here. Some people's lives are at risk when they take certain stances. And I think the church has to understand that. We in Trinidad are not accustomed to that kind of thing. In Latin America, it's much more so. In Germany during the war, that was very, very clear. In the pre-war period when it wasn't too clear where Hitler stood, and a lot of Catholics were beginning to understand what he was doing vis-a-vis Jews and so on, you had to take a stand. But in taking that stand, you put your own life at risk. And what was important was not just words of support, but deeds of protection. Can I open my house to somebody? And something which comes to my mind ever so often, if somebody loses their job because they have stood up for justice and truth, does the church support them in any way in terms of home, in terms of family, in terms of the money that they need to live? Unless we're thinking about that, we're joking. The other response that I think is important has to do with what corruption really is and whether we can ever be satisfied with legislation. I've become convinced over the years that any legislation, two things go wrong with it. The legislation is framed in such a way by the legislators deliberately very often so that there are loopholes that smart Alex can use. And I think we mustn't fool ourselves about that. We have some examples here in our own country. So the legislation itself, right, is hampered. But if we are to work, then what are we dealing with? One person once said that politicians are like diapers. They both need changing and for the same reason. When I first heard that, I had a good laugh. But apart from structuring our institutions, that people do not remain in situations of temptation for long periods, which make them become accustomed, as Raymond is saying, accustomed to the corruption around them. Apart from that, I think there is a deeper challenge for us. When we think corruption, we think usually of something that is either dying or dead. Right? When I think corruption, one of the places I think of is La Perouse Cemetery. Okay? The stench that comes from corruption comes precisely as an analogy of death. The Christian answer to death is not resuscitation. The Christian answer to death is resurrection. The Christian answer to death is not dressing up a corpse. The Christian answer to death is not avoiding life. The Christian answer to death has always been new life and new creation. And therefore, in the face of the corruption that is all around us, we have to ask ourselves, how do we create new people and new institutions that can be strong enough to withstand the temptation to corruption in all its forms? And that is the task of Catholics in the workplace, not simply as individuals, but as an organization. How do we develop the networks that will enable Catholics to face together whatever they have to face in the workplace? But then strategically, how do we begin to dream of a different approach to our politics, our economics, and even to our family life and our church that will enable us to make ourselves not so much immune from corruption as much as able to withstand it whenever it arises? I thank you.
Father, when you were speaking, you asked the question, you stated that we have to evaluate the situations that we are in. So I made a note to ask, how do we evaluate what we are facing? Because you're talking about two areas, the physical world where we are in and then our spirituality. What do we use to help us with that?
Oh, very good. Very good question. All of our moral theology, right, is built around, as Catholics, two things: Scripture and right reason. Right? Catholics do not just simply go by how we feel. Right? So what that means is that you have to know what are the imperatives of Scripture. You have to know particularly, and this is a distinction that is a very Catholic distinction, between what may be considered an absolute and what really is a moral demand in a context. Right? If you take the Ten Commandments, for example, one of the things that always amuses me is that parents are very quick to quote the commandment, honor your father and your mother, and you're not honoring me. But that commandment arose historically in a context where people were tempted to leave old people in the desert, right? To leave them because they were becoming a burden. It wasn't a commandment for children. It was a commandment for you and me. It is a commandment that challenges us radically about the care of the elderly, not about the care of your hale and hearty mother when you are 5 years old and she's 30 or 40 years old. It's not about that in its original. Right? So we have to be able to understand these things. Right? Of course, the information that we have becomes very, very, very important there. Are you sure that you have the facts. Because a lot of people have had egg on their faces because they were very quick to shout X, Y, Z, and then what happens then? Spiritually, there is something which is very important, and that is, as you confront corruption in any form, what is your strength? You know, one of the reasons why I got involved with Wayne Kublal Singh last year, November, December, was because somebody called me and said, Father Harvey, Wayne has the best of intentions, but he needs spiritual support. I went to see him. At first, I said to myself, But then he called, and I realized, hey, okay. But in the process, what happened was that you realize that it's one thing to stand firm against something. It's another thing to allow that something to transform you. Because sometimes you don't want to be transformed. You don't want the deeper commitment. And that was a discussion we had. You know, if you go through this, you know, if you are confronting the government, if you are saying that truth, transparency, and trust are the three values that you want to maintain in this, and there was no money involved from his perspective, the money was in other ways, you know, but he was fighting for certain values, you know, then to what extent are you willing to be transformed yourself by that? Okay?
Hello, Father. You were talking about people who are corrupt and they do not know that they are corrupt or something like that. But Father, in truth, we have come to recognize, if you will, a class of people who we would look at and say that they are corrupt. But for them, they are not doing anything wrong. It is normal. How do you reach out to a person like that, for example?
I wish I had the answer. Because one of my own principles is speaking truth to power, both inside and outside the church, right? And what I find is precisely what you're talking about, that people are very quick to rationalize their corrupt activities. In a certain sense, all you can do, in some circumstances, is just witness to the truth yourself. In the context in which you are, you try to bear faithful witness, right? And you hope that God will take that witness and use it. One of my favorite stories is of a priest who lived in this village, and young woman claims that she's pregnant and that he is the father of her child, right? Now, he knows that he's not the father. He also knows that the reason behind it is that he is the only one who can afford the abortion that she wants. So she concocts this story, broadcasts it, and comes, of course, we could get out of this. And he said no. He told her no. I am not doing it, and neither am I going to expose you and the father of your child to ridicule in the village. And he stood his ground through the 9 months of the pregnancy. And when the two young people realized what he had done, they themselves, right, came forward. I suspect the birth of the child and the fact that the child didn't look like the would have led them to decide. But sometimes that's all you can do. Stand your ground morally, bear witness as best you can to other values as well, because he was maligned, people talk all kind of things, right? And then trust God, that business of trust for God to work it through.
Can you expand on the theology of compromise and dealing with recognition of the lesser of two evils.
Yeah. The first thing I would do is to tell you that you could read Niebuhr, Niebuhr, an American theologian, moral theologian, ethicist, who has done extensive work on this, especially as an advisor to American presidents while he was alive. Truman, Eisenhower, to some extent Kennedy. Basically, what it says is that in seeking the will of God, you do not come to extreme positions. Right? That's not your first choice. There will be times when extreme and prophetic positions may be necessary, but particularly in the realm of social life and politics and economics, very often you are caught between two goods, two evils, and you have to choose somewhere in between. And you have to have the moral courage not to want the certainty that so often people seek. Because a lot of us would like to be certain, but it's a mess. It's a mess. That happens on a personal level sometimes, right? When you're in a situation where you might lose your house. Right? As I see a banker there, your mortgage is in trouble. What are you to do? What are you to do? Both choices are evil. Both choices will lead to people in all kinds of difficult situations, people suffering and so on. What do? You have to understand that there are situations where you have to compromise. By the way, what that means is that you don't go around saying that, oh, I'm okay and it's okay. You understand that in that situation in which you are, you have done the best you can, and you leave it up to God to determine how he uses the best that you can.
Good morning, Father. Pleasure to be here. My thing is, as you grow more spiritually, which is, a position I find myself in, you become more aware, especially in the workplace. You become more aware of situations, persons who are not always walking on the right road. And as a Catholic in the workplace, sometimes you observe situations and you come across information that causes you to ponder and, like you said, think and, figure out if you have the information and what you do with it. I also heard a speech some time ago by Dr. Raza at a conference, and she talked about not doing any moral policing. Now, how do you balance, moral policing and still doing the right thing, speaking out? Because sometimes you may find yourself in a situation where in the entire workplace, you're the only one who feels compelled to say, this is wrong, or I saw you did that, or, you may be walking around as a goody two-shoes, or what's wrong with her or him, So do you always say something? Do you always speak out? Do you all, without being too, because we will all sin and we all fall short of the glory of God. But sometimes I feel, God, they're going to think, oh gosh,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the key word there is police. No, you can bear witness in a situation without being a policeman. You can let people know what you stand for without being a policeman. When you talk, from the time you call the police, you are calling people to take action which can have consequences which you may not want. I face that situation a lot in the world of gangs. Some people don't like what I do, but I think my task is to be the kind of person who can say to fellas, listen, you see that? Like up to 2 days ago, a fella comes to see me. He say, I'll go kill this so-and-so, I tell him he's wrong, right? We sit there, we talk it through. You absorb some of the anger that is in him, right? But what the police are also clear about, and this is something I'm very happy about, there's a difference between a task force policeman, let's use that category, and a community policeman. A community policeman is there as a presence. He's there, he's in the midst of the community, he's like Leven and East in the door, and he ain't locking up nobody, one would hope. The task force policeman comes in, and anybody he see, he go lock up, all right? One is concerned about the balance in the community. One is concerned about the health of the community. One is concerned about keeping the community intact. All right? And there are times when I have been privy to things, and I've said to myself, no, I'm not going down that road. Let me call people, talk to them, try and see whether I can keep, particularly in family situations, something intact, rather than creating the kind of situation where everybody is exposed, everybody is in trouble, and then there's more anger than healing. In the world of business, it's not as much of a feel and a sensitivity situation, but I think what you have to be clear on is that, and this is where I think Francis is leading us in a different direction. What he's saying is it's much more important to proclaim the good news, which you don't do by hectoring. You do that by the light of your own life, right? Than it is to go around telling people, you're committing murder, you're in mortal sin, those kinds of things. A lot of people don't like him for it, but I think he's right on the button in terms of what Jesus is all about. And if I might take something from Francis, it's not so much important that you sweep out your workplace as much as that you help it to smell better because you're there.